I now turn it over to Ellen Bender with Markers for Democracy to introduce our speakers who will discuss our next battle, which is keeping New York blue.
Thank you, Erica. And since I have the mic, I want to thank our co-hosts, Downtown Nasty Women Social Group, Larchmont Mamaroneck, Indivisible, our panelists, and to all of you for joining us this evening. I have the honor of introducing our panelists. Former New York State Senator Alessandra Biaggi, for whom many of us wrote postcards in the summer of 2018 and cheered when she won that seat against the head of the IDC. We've admired her work in the state Senate on combating sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace. And I think that I read that you were planning to attend Harvard Divinity School next year, which honestly sounds like the coolest thing to me. Michael Haxby is Vice President of Organizing at New Kings Democrats and active in the Brooklyn Can't Wait campaign. He's also a soccer analytics writer and podcaster and analyzes political data, which he has presented to Democratic clubs and grassroots groups around New York. David Pepper is an author of multiple political thrillers and the must-read Laboratories of Autocracy, which details the dysfunction and corruption of the Ohio State Legislature, but also applies to many state legislatures around the country. He's the former chair of the Ohio Democratic Party and tweeted out a thread after the midterms about what he thought a good state Democratic Party should look like. David does wonderful whiteboard explainer videos on Twitter about politics and history, so follow him. Indeed, follow all of our panelists. Luba Gretchen Shirley was the Democratic candidate for Congress in New York 02 on Long Island in 2018, and her experience running for office with young children and then having to petition the FEC to be able to spend campaign funds on childcare inspired her to found Vote Mama, a wonderful organization that encourages and supports Democratic moms running for office up and down the ballot. Ben Yee is a member of the New York State Democratic Committee from the 66th Assembly District. He's been involved in politics at the local, state, and national level, and also has educated thousands of New Yorkers about getting involved in politics and party governance. He has mentored and encouraged a bunch of people on the Zoom to get involved in county committee. We are also fortunate to have the perfect moderator for this evening. Joseph O'Neill is an award-winning novelist and writes a column about US politics for the New York Review of Books, where in the aftermath of the 2022 election, he wrote a column that I sent around to everyone I know titled New York's Rusty Political Machine. And he also has had a series of tweets that recognize the power of the grassroots groups, like the 4 groups co-hosting tonight and the many other groups joining us, that came about in the aftermath of the 2016 election, and the unique combination of volunteer and ActBlue donor energy that has become a real force in US politics, even if not always acknowledged by the rusty party machinery. So I will turn it over to Joseph to get us started. And in terms of format, we will hear from each of the panelists and then have an opportunity for a discussion and Q&A. Thanks again.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's hosting and all the groups involved and all the kind of mainly female faces I see at the top of the screen who basically saved the United States over the last 6 years. So thank you very much for doing that. I'm delighted to be here with these panelists to discuss and potentially dissect the slightly alarming November 2022 New York election results. I suppose Michael will, who I'll turn to first, will give us, I think, a blow-by-blow account of quite how alarming it was. But I'll only say that the only thing is that New York was, I think, arguably the worst performing state in the United States for Democrats. And so obviously that calls for some inquiry. And in the aftermath of the election, a cry went out, I suppose. It was that desperate for Jay Jacobs to move aside, and we'll talk about Jay Jacobs in more detail later on, and more generally, for a new kind of politics to finally control democratic efforts in this state, and we'll talk about that as well. David will be talking about what a potential model democratic party state apparatus would look like. And Ben and Alessandra and Luba will give us a more potentially factual approach to about how to manage the situation and the politics. But in any case, I'll start straight away with we'll start straight away with Michael Hacksby and ask you, Michael, what actually happened in November 22? What were the results, and why should we be concerned? And I suppose could you please illuminate what happened for us?
Hey, y'all. I'm Michael Hacksby. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, all the hosts. And I've got a little slideshow here to go through some charts. I sort of pulled out the maps, try to speed it up a little bit. But what I want to do is like set a baseline for us and sort of how did things go wrong? How bad did things go? Where were the problems? And in a way, sort of, I want to set that up for then this is the baseline for what I want to talk about with the New York Democratic Party. So I'm just going to share my screen here and get started. So as you see here, when there is a midterm after a presidential election, that midterm usually goes to the party out of power. Over the last previous 4 midterms, they average an over 6-point win for the party out of power. Obviously, 2018, the Great Blue Wave was even larger than some of the Republican waves. 2022 was not. 2022, the best estimates that I've got from splitticket.org, by the way, if you want, like, there's some of the best election analysis going out there. They estimate this at 1.6% Republican advantage in the national popular vote, the national vote in all of the congressional elections. So Republicans did win a small majority at the House level, much, much, much smaller than what we would have expected coming in, certainly what everyone was fearing. And of course, this is a larger effect here from that we saw, because obviously Democrats held the Senate, actually gained a seat in the Senate. Democrats gained 2 governorships. Democrats flipped several state houses, including both houses in Michigan and Minnesota. And this is because there was a further Democratic success, not just the House level, but against mega candidates at Senator, Governor. This is a huge effect at Secretary of State races, where where candidates for Secretary of State who were election deniers tended to run behind the top of their ticket in those states by 5 to 10 points. So Democratic message discipline here made a big difference. They were able to identify particularly extreme mega Republicans and get voters to vote against them. And really, that's the story that we see nationally that I think is important to understand, is this really was a persuasion election nationwide. When you look at precincts where you can compare total votes between 2020 and 2022, it is very much Republican precincts that are the most likely to have turnout that was close to their 2022 level. Very Democratic precincts tended to have a significant drop in turnout. We're starting now, we don't have all of the numbers yet. We're starting to get numbers in from a few states, and I'm going to go through a few of those later on. But when you take the states that we do have finalized turnout and party registration data, it comports with about a +5 Republican nationwide electorate. That is not too far off. In fact, it's a little bit worse, but it's a little bit better for Democrats. But it's not too far off even from 2010, the Tea Party wave. The difference is that independent voters voted for Democrats by a small margin, whereas in these previous elections, independent voters have voted for the party out of power by a wide margin, typically by double digits, pushing 20 points. And so we want to see what we see nationwide is this story of a persuasion election where Democratic message discipline was highly effective at making voters see what the costs were of electing Republicans, that Republican extremism, particularly mega election deniers, but also obviously on anti-abortion Republicans who had taken stands to cut Social Security. All of those things came through very clearly. And while it did not turns out, successfully turn out a ton of Democratic voters. Could have done better on that. It did successfully turn a lot of persuadable voters against the Republicans. And that's why we didn't have a disaster nationwide. Yay. But of course, New York was different. There were 8 seats in the House that Biden won in 2020 that flipped. 4 of those 8 were in New York. Of those also, you can see some of these were pretty close, but the New York 3rd, the New York 17th, the New York 4th, those are districts that Biden won by wide margins. And those nonetheless flipped. 4 of the 5 Biden seats with the highest 2020 margin were in New York. We lost 5 seats from the New York Democratic delegation. Obviously, that would be enough for a very small majority. So New York really cost the Democrats more than any other state. You look at this, so there's a swing nationwide of a little under 4 points to the Republicans, but the swing to the Republicans in New York was nearly 14 points. Only Florida was even close, but New York was, by a significant margin, the largest swing from 2020 to 2022 to the Republicans. If you'd had a 14-point swing nationwide, you are talking about an absolutely massive red wave, larger than the blue wave of 2018. So this is, the losses are concentrated in New York because just all overall, things were worse in New York than anywhere else, 10 points worse than the nationwide average. And you see, in New York, it's not just a persuasion story. Looking at some of the places where we have data, these are states that have states or counties that have released full data from their voter files of what percentage of Democrats and what percentage of Republicans turned out to vote in 2022. So as you can see, everywhere, even in places like Clark County and Maricopa County, Clark County, Las Vegas, Nevada, Maricopa County, Phoenix, Arizona, where there was a significant push from Democrats, which successfully won big swing statewide elections. Not even there was a Republican turnout advantage, but that Republican turnout advantage was running in the range of 5 to 10 points. In New York, the Republican turnout advantage was about 16 points, about 63% turnout from Republicans, 47% turnout from Democrats. So while what we saw nationwide was particularly focused on Democratic effectiveness with their persuasion campaign, in New York, we need to also ask questions on top of the persuasion campaign about why turnout was so poor. And if you look at it, trying to look at some of these maps, this is the swing of the sort of persuasion swing. Where did Hochul run the furthest behind Biden's 2020 margin? And when you look at turnout, where were the places where turnout dropped the most from 2020? What you see is really the concentration of problems in the New York City metro area. The biggest swings of turnout came in New York City itself. Queens, Bronx in particular, Brooklyn as well, huge drops in turnout, while the biggest persuasion swings, a few of them were up by the Canadian border, but there the turnout wasn't as low. Otherwise, again, it was right in the suburbs. It was in Long Island, it was in Westchester. As you go up the Hudson Valley, it gets less and less pronounced. So we have a story that is really focused here in the New York City area. So what I argue is that the congressional map of flipped districts could look like a suburbs problem, maybe, but I would consider it really, when you look closely, a New York City metro area problem. You can also see this when you look at like assembly district seats flipped. In the state assembly, Democrats lost seats that they haven't lost before in Brooklyn. Whereas at the federal level, those are within relatively safe Democratic congressional districts. If you look at, for instance, the loss in New York 19, you see a real swing to the Republicans, and a real swing to the Republicans in the range of like 6 or so points, Tompkins County being the biggest county in New York 19, and which is a larger swing than happened nationwide. Remember, a 4-point swing. So, 6-point swing, 4-point swing, a little bit worse. Nothing like the absolute wipeout in the third, where you're looking at, again, that like 15, 16-point swing from 2020. So once again, what we're seeing is the concentration of these problems in the New York City metro area. So what happened? And what I think I'd want to emphasize here is that there was no persuasion advantage that we can see. So all of that work that was done nationwide to identify Republicans with extremism on abortion, with extremism and election denial, with extremism on, fundamental government services didn't come through. There was no mega penalty. There's a larger swing in New York third. Like, so whatever else, it turned out there was a lot more someone could have said about George Santos, but he was also an election denier. And election deniers were losing elections by larger margins everywhere else, and this didn't come through. Lee Zeldin voted against certifying the election, and somehow this didn't come up. So he was a anti-abortion candidate. All of these things, these penalties that were paid by Republicans elsewhere, were not paid in New York State. Democratic turnout, even with a poor national standard, even with an understanding that for the most part, Democratic voters did not turn out at good rates anywhere, New York State nonetheless ran behind the national baseline of Democratic turnout. And we do see a clear epicenter of this problem in the New York City metro area. What I want to emphasize here is that the very things that were done so well at like a holistic level. So this is really a story of, sometimes when I work on analyses like this, there's like individual little places to dive into and say, okay, if you add up this little bit and this little bit and this little bit and this little bit, it tells the story. And you can dive in and find some interesting smaller things here. But for this presentation, I really wanted to keep it focused at the highest level because the failures were so wide-ranging, because the failures were across the board. And I think what you need to start asking is not what went wrong in the New York third. We don't want to get bogged down in what went wrong in individual race, because the problems were everywhere. The problems were statewide, even if there was maybe a sort of sink in the New York City area. The very things that were done well across the board by Democrats, message discipline, focused on issues where Democrats had the advantage, making these elections about abortion rights, making these elections about Republican extremism, making these elections about the threats to fundamental government programs posed by Republicans. All of those were done so effectively in New York City, in New York State, but I think in New York City more than anywhere else, we just had this election about crime. There was a failure of that message discipline, and there was a failure to define Republican extremism and make a mega penalty that should have existed in New York State, should have existed in these particular congressional districts, and did not come through. So that's sort of what I want to hand off to the other speakers. I'm happy to take questions at whatever point we take questions, but is that what we see in New York State is an across-the-board failure with real costs for the national party, because they did not do the fundamental political things at the highest level that the party nationwide was so effective at doing.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I'd just like to emphasize one point, which is that there are lots of blue states in America with the same kind of profile in relation to, say, the abortion issue or the crime issue, and they didn't do nearly as badly as the United States, New Jersey, as New Jersey, for example. So New York was uniquely and idiosyncratically awful, and the obvious response, I suppose, the elephant in the room was the New York State Democratic Party, the biggest structure of all, and there was a kind of instantaneous, almost spontaneous consensus among everyone who sort of was on the Democratic side of the equation that something had to be done about the state party. And on any view in modern politics, it's a problem when, for example, I, a New York voter, am donating much more to the Wisconsin State Party, Democratic Party, than I am to the New York Party. It wouldn't even occur to me to donate to the New York Party. They don't even want my money, as far as I'm aware. So we have a big structural problem immediately apparent. And to investigate and to put into context that structural problem, we turn now to David Pepper. And David has thought hard about, among other things, what a state Democratic Party generically, ideally, should look like, and what possibly we might want to think about going forward in New York.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really that was a very eye-opening presentation. Thank you for that. And you know, beaming in from another state, it's hard. I don't want to overstate how much I know about the operation in New York, but I do want to give a big picture. You know, I was the party chair here for 6 years, which in the world of party chairs, believe it or not, made me grandpa. One of the problems around the country is the turnover in party chairmanships is so quick that it's always a struggle to frankly have most of them be well run. But in my time there, I kind of, you know, just observed DNC and other, you know, there were all sorts of groups, and I was part of what's called the State Democratic Party Association. It really was clear to me that there's a spectrum that I want to talk about of parties. And for different reasons, different states end up in different places. One part of the country, and this is a problem, big picture, that we often think about the DNC is to think about, because these parties are playing, as you're experiencing in New York, this massive role in whether or not we protect our democracy, yet we're not really treating them in that way. So you have on the red state side, parties that are so underfunded and so under capacity, they almost have no staff.
Right.
Almost all their chairs are part-time at best. They often are lawyers or, believe it or not, political consultants trying to juggle all that. And they have very little capacity. On the other side, you have in blue states, my observation, again, without criticizing, kind of the old school party way, kind of the old sort of boss. We're sort of, you know, loyal to one major elected official in our state, and that's our function. Illinois was a classic example of that. Other blue states were, for the most part, as you just described in New York, people aren't worried about whether their states could turn red or blue. So the party gets less and less relevant as to whether or not you need a good party to win. So that party becomes sort of this old school creature of one official. And then what I'll describe as, I think, the ideal party, and I think, you know, the good news is we do have a number of these, and you mentioned Ben Wickler in Wisconsin. I think Ohio has had this traditionally. A number of other parties, Minnesota, very well run. Michigan, LaVar Barnes, very well run. I would call it sort of the new type of party. I would best call it, and I tried to think about this when I was chair, it's like a nonprofit model where you have a mission statement. And the mission statement is beyond just one official. You're not there just for this candidate or that candidate. You're not simply under the wing of the governor or the senator that everyone likes. You have a broader mission like a nonprofit. And it's not just one person's fiefdom. You actually have multiple stakeholders. You're always reporting. This is what I try to do as party chair. You're always reporting to those stakeholders. You're transparent like a good nonprofit would be. But the most important thing is defining that mission statement. And that mission statement is much more than just helping that one candidate that happens to be the top of the heap at that moment. And sometimes I think in these very blue states, it slips into that. And so my mission statement, I defined when I was ODP chair. People can argue all day if I succeeded or not, but it was elect great public servants and then help them do great service once they get there. And that meant my mission was to serve and help Sherrod Brown. And it was to serve and help a county commission candidate. It was to win congressional seats, mayor seats, and everything else. So I set this broader mission statement. And and as some of you know, because you helped, in some years, the most critical part of that mission was we can win some Supreme Court seats. Let's go to town to do that. So you thought about it in this broader, again, the first thing a nonprofit does is develop its mission statement. That's what we would do. And then everything follows from that. Like, this is a very good government approach, but if you look at Ben Wickler, LeVar Barnes, this is what they're doing. And then everything follows from that. The dollars you raise are towards the mission, and you can explain to those giving what it's for. And of course, going back to Michael's presentation, a strong get out the vote operation and broader messaging effort in that state is critical to accomplishing those missions. By setting up that mission statement, though, you also give yourself goals every single year, including what we too often call the off year, which isn't off at all, but go win a lot of local races, maybe in swing areas, maybe make sure you're never taking for granted certain Democratic areas, you're really lifting turnout in those areas through mayors and school board races. But everything follows from that. And then you have, again, and this is something I worry that in red states, you don't have because you can't afford it. In other states, it may not happen because it's not the culture. You have a professional staffing and role playing like any other nonprofit would. I believe strongly, and I don't know the situation in New York, I believe very strongly that we have too many states with part-time chairs and part-time executive directors. There's too much to do to succeed in that kind of model. Again, some states are forced to do it, but I'm a lawyer. If I had been stuck billing hours as a lawyer and trying to run the party, it wouldn't have worked. In some places, you have elected officials also trying to be party chair. I know you had that in New York for a time. That's not going to work. There's too much to do. There's too many things. There's too much risk of going backward. And as we learned just now painfully, you may be a blue state, but there's a lot of impact about how blue you are to the country. And your broader mission statement should reflect that. And if you're caught up in simply one person's politics, one official's politics, you may lose sight of all the other parts of that broader mission statement. So in the grand scheme of things, what I would say to folks on this call is knowing that, there's this spectrum, the sort of old party boss, one official's fiefdom model to the ideal nonprofit model. And across the country, it's going to be a vast variety. But I would assess, are you seeing indications of being on one side or the other? And the news is the best parties in this country, again, Minnesota and Ken Martin, LeVar Barnes in Michigan, Wisconsin, they will look as close to, now they'll have certain elected officials that are more prominent, certain stakeholders that give more. Joseph, to your point, if they have that broader stakeholder mentality, of course they're asking you for support. Of course they are. They want that broad support. If they're under only one person's wing, they're not even worrying about it. And that's kind of an alarm bell. So once and by the way, the other thing I'll say and then close is, I know a lot of folks on this call because you've done wonderful things everywhere. And I would greatly worry that if the mission isn't defined appropriately, it means they're not even talking to you. Because if the mission was defined appropriately, you'd want to harness all the energy on all these groups to go win, right? You wouldn't just let Ben Wickler and me do it from other states. You'd be talking to you all saying, my God, this is incredible. One of the things I had to do when I was chair, believe it or not, and you may enjoy this, was we did every year, I did a county party summit, trying to help every county party understand how it could do the best job possible, how it could use this sort of nonprofit mission-driven approach. And at that annual summit, I literally began, just like a lot of you got fired up after Trump won, we had all sorts of wonderful indivisible and other progressive groups emerge all over Ohio. It's one of the reasons we changed our constitution to try and end gerrymandering. It was those groups. I literally had to do training sessions to the county parties. How do you work with these new progressive groups? Don't view them as a threat. View them as an asset. Don't tell them, well, that's not the way we've ever done things before. Tell them, oh, you have new ways of doing things. Amazing. We'd love to have your energy here in this county. And I found, in a lot of counties, I'm not saying this to be critical. It's just, there was a clash because the old school model viewed these new progressive groups in some rural county as a threat to them. And I saw it as the greatest energy ever that county had seen in years. So figure out how to harness it, even if those people aren't going to your Saturday morning meetings. So there's just, I think the bigger picture though is, and this is very, 30,000 foot level, but I think that broader nonprofit model is how to think about it. And I honestly think some of the blue state parties, they're just not close to that yet. And again, I don't know, I can't speak to the day-to-day of New York, but my guess is it's not that. And I think people should start really saying, we know where it's working. And to Michael's presentation, a mission-driven party is doing your assessment and saying to itself, what kind of program do we need to put in place around messaging, around, by the way, you'll like this. I did an entire brand building exercise throughout the entire state to try and get all the candidates on the same page about what being a Democrat meant and how they could communicate that locally. That was something that I viewed as part of my mission. We obviously were always concerned about get out the vote in a way that would help everybody. And that's, once you set out on that mission, all those operations, all those programs become kind of obvious. If you're simply a function of an individual, that stuff potentially doesn't happen. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David. That's you say you say it's a high altitude picture you're drawing, but a lot of us here don't find it high altitude at all. We find it very illuminating. And for more, our next speaker will be Ben Yee, who is the opposite of David in some ways, in that he's all about New York. He knows all about the New York State Democratic Party. So please illuminate us, Ben.
I do definitely appreciate that David is not here to criticize the New York State Party, but I'm a Democratic State Committee man, so I am. And I've been asked to run everybody through how the state party really works on a day-to-day level. And I'm not going to spoil this by jumping out ahead and telling you which of the three models New York subscribes to. But I suspect that by the end of what I have to share, it'll be very apparent to everybody on this call. But I've got some slides, so pretty pictures for everybody. Let me just share my screen. All right, so the New York State Democratic Party. Now, as was mentioned a little bit earlier, I go around talking about this a lot, getting people to run for things like county committee and state committee. And if you don't know what those things are, that's fine. You're about to find out. But if you have questions, because I'm going to cover a bunch of stuff that normally I cover in more time in a very short period, this is how to get at me. Just know that I'm not great at emails. Very sorry in advance. All right, let's just jump right in here. So the party structure. So the Democratic Party is broken up into effectively three levels. So is the Republican Party. Really, all parties are. You have a national level, and then you have a state level, and then you have a local level. And here in New York, the local level is the county level. So every level has its own party, and every level of the party has its own governing committee. The county party has a county committee. Those people are elected by voters, by registered Democrats. So you're voting for your county party leadership. The state party has a state committee. That's what I serve on. Again, those people, myself included, are elected by registered Democrats in the primary election. So the people who are running the show here, the people who are doing a good job or a bad job or whatever you think of them, those people are elected directly by Democratic Party voters, with the exception of the DNC. The DNC, those folks are selected by the state committee members. So if you think that the national party is messed up, go talk to your state committee members who you've elected directly in the primary, because they're responsible for choosing your state's representative to that organization. Now, at every level, there's things that the that these parties do, that these committees are in charge of, and it is different for each level of the organization. So again, starting from the county level, and I know we're talking about the state party, but these counties are important because they're the on the ground force, right? They have as much to do with what's happening in these local elections as the state party does. And they're not subservient to the state party, but they are meant to be allies. So the county parties are there to raise their own money. They get direct fundraising and they get money from the state committee. A big thing that you're going to hear the state committee talk about, if you listen to Jay Jacobs, who's the current chair, is that he gives money to county organizations to do field work. We'll get into that. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, who knows? Well, I mean, we know, but we'll get into it. Anyway, they're responsible for sort of local level campaigning. County executives, county legislatures, not things we have here in New York City, but if you're from outside of New York City, you're familiar with all of these little, I don't want to say little races, but smaller districts, dog catcher, a highway superintendent, and such. The state party then has some really critical infrastructure that it is, in theory, laying down for those county organizations. It is in charge of the van. I'm going to explain the van because it's a very critical piece of infrastructure that can be used, more or less effectively, depending. This is the database of all of the voters that all of the campaigns that have been contacted through all of Democratic Party organizing history, all those folks who have been contacted and what we know about them. Every time a campaign goes out, if they're using the Democratic Party's infrastructure, they have to report that data back. It all goes into the central repository called the van. It's maintained by the national party, but the states are given access to it to then distribute to campaigns in their own state. Now, the states could give that out for free to their campaigns, or they can charge money for it. They basically get to decide how to do it. New York State charges it. It's one of its sources of income. So the state party is charging the campaigns to access this data. State party also raises a bunch of money, although not that much if you consider how large New York is. At any given time, the state party has about $1 million in the bank, which, given what you might think New York State could fund, since there are millions and millions of Democrats here and it's a very large, wealthy state, you might think that's quite paltry, but that's what it does. And it also gets some money from the DNC occasionally. So in 2018, for example, we received money from the DNC to run field campaigns for congressional races. We haven't done anything like that since, and we certainly didn't spend our own money on that. We were spending DNC money. The thing that the state party does spend most of its time, I want to say most of its time and resources doing, but this isn't really true because it doesn't really do anything. But what it's theoretically talking about a lot is winning state campaigns. So governor in particular, and then state assembly, state senate. And then the national level, I won't spend a lot of time on this. They're dealing with presidential elections and they just raise a shit ton of money, pardon my language, and then they funnel that money or some fraction of that money to the state parties. So what's important to understand is that none of these levels of the party tell each other what to do. It is not hierarchical. County parties are directly elected, state parties are directly elected, national party, even though those members are selected by the state parties, it's not a hierarchy. But there's money flowing around, and usually what happens is funding flows from the national level to the state level to the county level, and some of that is occasionally used for compulsion to make people do what you want, even though you don't have direct authority. Now let's look at the state party in and of itself and how it relates to campaigns. So if you hear Jay Jacobs talk, again, who's the current chair of the state party, he will say that the state party is just a housekeeping account. This is technically true. The state party under New York State election law is organized to have a housekeeping political action committee. This is basically money that gets spent on infrastructure. So things like offices for the state party, offices for any of the, you could give money to the county committees, so offices for them, on the ground sort of stuff. It also goes towards staff. What it can't be used for is the support or defeat of any ballot initiatives or candidates, right? So it's not for explicit campaigning, but it is for trainings, it is for centralized resources and all of that stuff. Now, this is really important because if you hear the state party talk today about what New York State's party is supposed to be doing, It's just doing this housekeeping stuff, right? That's why we don't raise a lot of money, because why would we hire organizers if we can't support a ballot initiative, if we can't support or oppose a candidate? I really want you to understand that that's a bogus argument, because one, the housekeeping account can be used for infrastructure and voter contact, in between elections and simply promoting the ideals of the Democratic Party. And two, the state part of, so mission driven, like, does this sound like a mission driven organization that's trying to help people? You can ask yourself. But aside from the fact that it, is a housekeeping account, it can also open any other kind of account that it wants. And it actually does have multiple other accounts. DACC for electing assembly members, state assembly, DSCC for electing state senators, a state account for doing statewide races, and even federal accounts for, in theory, helping to elect folks to Congress and to the federal Senate. And then even if you said, well, the state party is doing an okay job there, but we're getting slammed on ballot initiatives, because if you remember 2021, we basically lost really important voter enfranchisement ballot initiatives. The state party doesn't have any political action committee or campaign account to support those or oppose those, but it could. It could. All of this is completely feasible under the state party's structure in New York State election law. It simply chooses not to do any of these things right now. And I want to drive home the ballot initiative thing, because so much of why we lost these last elections, I mean, really great analysis earlier, but we could have had vote by mail. We could have had same-day voter registration if those ballot initiatives had passed in 2021, but we were destroyed, 30-70 on these things because nobody on the Democratic side put any resources behind them. The party does maintain these committee accounts, and I want to explain to you how they work and what they do. First, they're in the state Democratic Party rules. You can read about them and you can go look how these committees operate. But basically, they're created to do the day-to-day planning in between elections for how to win races to their respective offices. This is the central committee. This is for statewide office like governor, comptroller, and then also the federal stuff. So senator and House. Then you've got DAC, which is for the assembly, and that's controlled by the speaker. And then you've got the DSCC controlled by the leader of the Senate here in New York. So of these items, of the money that the state party raises, the only thing that's really controlled internally to the state committee is the DCC, which is the Democratic Campaign Committees. All of the money, millions and millions and millions of dollars that go for DAC and the DSCC, which are geared towards the state legislative bodies, these are controlled by the legislators, okay? In theory, the state committee can put its hands on them by a vote of the committee itself, but in practice, these monies are separated out, which is important because most of politics revolves around the three people in a room, which is the governor, the leader of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House. And none of those people really want money going anywhere else except their own coffers. So this is Jay Jacobs, if you've never seen him before. Let's talk about what actually his role in all of this is. So we're going to take out DAC and we're going to take out the DSCC, and they're all hoarding money themselves. And we could say hoarding, using, spending. I'll let the state senator, or former state senator, on the call talk about how that goes. But for the state committee itself, what we are actually dealing with here, what the state committee brings to the table is cheap mail rates. We got a special bulk mail rate that allows us to send mail. And one of the things that candidates will do is give money to the party and have the party send mail on their behalf because it's cheaper. We also control the voter activation network, as mentioned before. These are both infrastructural items that give the state party a competitive advantage when it comes to campaigning, if it chooses to use these things effectively. There's also staff in here. That money pays for staff. So we're paying for mail, we're paying for the voter file, or its maintenance, and we're paying for staff. Now, right now, who's the staff of the party? We have one executive director who's full-time, and that person is not the chair. That person is not really a campaign organizer either. Now, we've had different types of people occupying these roles in the past, but for what it's worth, At the moment, we have one staff member, really, the executive director, and we have Jay Jacobs, who has a business, right? To go back to what David Pepper was saying, it's not even a part-time job. This is a volunteer gig for him. Now, the party could also be spending its money on ads. As mentioned, the party could be doing messaging during elections, in between elections. Some of this could come from the housekeeping account. We definitely have campaign accounts we can be spending money on. I don't know if anybody's ever seen an ad from the state party, but I certainly haven't, and I'm on it. How do people get into these positions of power? What makes Jay Jacobs, Jay Jacobs? Let's just talk about the structure here for a little bit. And I know I'm talking a lot, so I'm going to try to wrap this up right afterwards. But party voters are the base of this thing. I've said it before, I'm going to say it a lot. All of these state committee members are directly elected, and that impacts who becomes the leader. So we're elected. There's basically two per an assembly district, one male, one female, which is the terms mandated by the state constitution. Whole other issue there, won't go into it. But basically two per an assembly district. Math is a little off. Then inside the state committee, you've got caucuses. There's an unlimited number of these theoretically, but we currently only have 3. A progressive caucus, which everybody's in, so you can decide whether that makes it progressive or not. A youth caucus, which is the Young Democrats, and then rural caucus, right? Which is basically everything north of the Hudson Valley. The state committee members can join the caucuses, which is just a way for them to sort of organize themselves, and then they elect the executive board. Now, this is also important. The executive board members don't have to be on the state committee. So Jay Jacobs is not a state committee member. He's just there because somebody, the governor, liked him and said, I want this to be my person. And the state committee members elected that person instead of one of their own, or instead of somebody who would, treat this as a job, and then the state committee would have to put funding behind that. So state committee members elect the executive board. These are all the members of the executive board. There's a lot of them. Most of them don't. I mean, they might personally do a lot, but functionally speaking, they're not doing a ton for the party. There are something like 13 vice chairs, and they don't do much. In theory, it's an unlimited number of vice chairs. We could have 1 billion of these people, but again, they're all volunteers. Everybody on this list is a volunteer. Nobody is paid for anything they're doing. And so, just sort of go along to get along. And then there are committees. There are executive committees. This includes the standing committees that are the campaign committees, DAC, the DSCC, ethics committees, resolutions committees. Again, nobody's paid. It's all volunteer. And all of the committee members who are in theory doing executive functions of the party, they're all appointed to those committees by the chair directly. It's not that there's no vote of the conference, nothing like that. Everything comes directly from the state chair. So whoever's the state chair is quite important, which is why whoever is the governor is quite important. And I just want you to understand the dynamics here. David Pepper did a great job identifying the 3 models of Democratic parties. I don't know if there's 3, but I can tell you that we're this one. The Democratic Party of New York State is beholden to the governor. And the reason for this, makes a lot of sense when you think about it. And I want you to know the incentive structure that is set up in the state. The governor introduces the state budget. That's a lot of money. The governor passes laws into the state budget. So if the governor, wants a law passed, they can just include that right into the budget. You can literally pass a law alongside something that's supposed to be all about numbers. Governor also vetoes bills. Governor is, I say universally beloved, but they're the #1 vote getter. They lead the ticket. They have the most people, the largest district in the state. They have a lot of political capital. And what that means is that people are afraid of them. If your state committee member upsets the governor by doing something dinky in this tiny organization, which may or may not be meaningful at all, your assembly member will hear about it. They might not get their bill passed. Their bill might be vetoed. There might be a threat of a veto against their bill, which simply takes it off the table. Your county might not get funding for its highways. So people are very, very afraid to speak out because of the lock that the governor and other Democratic established leadership have over the resources of the state. And then there's this guy. Andrew Cuomo massively divested from the state party. I mentioned this before, but Andrew Cuomo in particular not unlike the state assembly and Senate leadership, did not want resources going to the state party. They wanted things being channeled through the entities that they actually controlled. So money that could be raised for the state party was instead directed to Andrew Cuomo's campaign coffers. And he had lots of money coming in, and then he would give money from his campaign to the state to fund the state's operations. And it's one of the reasons that to this day, the state doesn't really take fundraising seriously. The state organization's infrastructure was the governor's campaign infrastructure. And that really did a great job funneling all political power through a single individual. Now, there are some other things that the state committee does. So I'll just run them through them real quick and then I'm done. We just spoke about all the campaign stuff, really critical. Again, DNC selection, which does have impacts higher up the food chain, and also how much in money New York receives from the DNC for organizing. We do some delegate selection for the national conventions every 4 years. We control primary ballot access in the statewide elections. We also create the resolutions, which presumably or ostensibly are the party platform. And when you talk about mission driven, let me tell you, we passed resolution after resolution saying what the Democratic Party does. It wasn't until our last meeting that these things even went on the website. Like they just vanished into the ether. But a rules change at the last meeting means that now they'll be on the website, but you can't have a mission if you can't articulate what you believe publicly. And we were not doing that. And there was no real way to create this message. And so, you know, that's the state party as we know it, or as we have it, I should say, in a nutshell. And again, if I went really fast, feel free to get at me and ask your questions, but I'm done and I'm sorry for taking so much time.
No, thank you for that slightly daunting exposition of the financial kind of labyrinth that is the New York State Democratic Party and the various kind of opportunities it offers, you know, established power brokers to influence the discourse within the party. And it's on that note. And by the way, I just want to mention the fantastically kind of interesting and prolific comments that are being posted. And they sort of set me up for my next speaker, which is Luba Grayton-Shirley, who may or may not go by LGS. I don't know. Is that something that's happened yet? But it seems to be kind of very powerful thing to sort of go by 3 letters. But and I suppose just to put these comments to you as a, not necessarily for you to answer them, but just as an introduction for you, Luba, people are a lot of its suspicion is being expressed about the actual personnel in the party, in the state party, and in fact, Alessandra herself has said something quite pointed about the chair, which I'm sure she'll get to. So I suppose having described the kind of structures of the party and the problems that we experienced in the election and their potential relationship, what do you think about how do we go forward? And I suppose what lessons do you draw from in particular the Long Island results in November?
Thank you. I have so much to say and I don't even know where to start. And listening to everybody on this call, I'm just going to say it all and I'm going to be not PC about it. Listening to David talk about having a mission was actually making me stressed because we can't even get to the point of having a mission because we don't have a party chair. And I'm going to talk about Long Island because that's where my personal experience is. We have both a Suffolk County chair who does not want to elect Democrats and a Nassau County chair who does not want to elect Democrats, who is now also the party state chair. So we can't get to having a mission because we don't have state chairs who actually themselves have the goal of electing Democrats. Their goal is to stay in power. And I am going to be so blunt about this because after this election, and I have watched this happen election season after election season, it has to change and we have to do something about it. I will tell you my personal experience. I was a county committee member in the city. I grew up on Long Island. I moved back to Long Island when I started to have children. I had no intention of running for Congress. After the election, I wanted to get involved. I reached out to the party repeatedly, never got any response, kept going. Nobody would get back to me. I ended up starting an Indivisible group. I ended up foiling the entire county committee list for Suffolk County and going through it because I am a data nerd. I literally looked at where we stood for each town committee. We were 50% vacant. And when I would start to call people who were on county committee, many of them had no idea they were on county committee. People get appointed to county committee for the sole purpose of voting Jay and Rich into power. The reality is that most of those people who serve on county committee count on Jay and Rich, and by Jay and Rich, I mean Jay Jacobs and Rich Schaefer, for their actual jobs, their daily paying jobs. And so we have this cycle of corruption on Long Island and throughout the state where it's literally just party patronage. So I ended up running for office, wasn't planning on doing it, and I was more attacked by the Democratic Party than I ever was by the Republican Party. The reality is they started to take anything that I had ever said on social media that they could use against me, and they started to take screenshots of it before I knew that I had any intention of running for Congress. Before I decided to run for Congress, to give you a little bit of an idea of how it works locally, there was a local town council race that I never wanted to run for, but WFP said they would back me, and I went to Rich Schaefer and I said, look, you're not running a Democrat for this open seat. And his exact words to me were, I made the deal 4 months ago. And I said, what deal did you make? There's always a seat on the Babylon Town Council that goes to somebody on the Republican and conservative line. That's just the deal they make. They have this deal where Islip goes to the Republicans and Babylon stays to the Democrats, and they give up certain seats. The majority of seats on Long Island are not real elections. So people on Long Island don't actually know that they need to come out and vote. They don't know that they need to come out and knock on doors. We have this consistent situation where people will run for office, they'll get into this position, and then they'll step down right before they're actually term limited so that our party bosses can choose who gets put into that seat. We had that situation recently with a town council person and a county committee person. Not county committee, county legislature. And they both stepped down right after they got sworn in again, so that Rich Schaefer could then take one of their chief of staff and make him the Democratic nominee and then appoint the other person to the town council. What this means is that for 24 years in my district, no one has had a real person to vote for on the ballot. It's always been an appointed person by the county chair. And frankly, it could have been the way before that, but I haven't looked back past 24 years. This happens so often. So I decided to run for the seat. I decided to get signatures to get on the ballot. During the week that I was going to do this, specifically to prove a point, I was called by every person you can imagine. I was offered jobs to work for Babylon Town Council. No interest at all in doing that. I was told not to wade my leg into the deep waters of local politics. I was threatened. I was called names. And eventually they finally came to me when they realized I wasn't going to step back on this. And I wanted to prove that you need to run Democrats. And they said, all right, we're going to run a Democratic person for this seat. You made us do it. This person worked for Babylon Town Council. She reported directly to Rich Schaefer because not only is he the Suffolk County Democratic chairman, he is the Babylon chair. He is also the Babylon Town supervisor. So he has multiple hats here. So I said, great, you're running a Democrat, I'm going to step down. They never collected the signatures to get her on the ballot, and that seat went to a Republican. And that's how Long Island politics work. So when I ran for Congress, every time I knocked on a door, everyone was like, you're the first person to come to knock on this door and talk to me. And they were amazed. And every time somebody runs for Congress on Long Island, and I suspect in many parts of the state, they have to build the infrastructure from the ground up. I was reading some of these chats talking about Michigan. Michigan has a strong Democratic Party. We have no Democratic Party. There is no infrastructure. There are people who serve on county committee who don't know what that means and don't know they're on it. And there are those who know that they are just there to vote for the party chair. So you can't change these things unless you take over county committee. We tried to do this. We actually tried to organize, and both Jay and Rich suppress people from joining county committee. It only happens every 2 years, and they actually put up a big fight. They don't appoint people who are interested in joining. And then when people do get on county committee, they end up getting so burnt out by the corruption that they quit, because they know as an individual, they're not going to be able to make any change, and they can't take it anymore because it is the old boys club. They make deals with the Republicans. Peter King stayed in office for almost 30 years because they never ran a strong Democratic candidate. We came closer to unseating him than anyone had. And we did that because we ran a real race. And the Democratic Party fought me every step of the way. They did not want to see a real Democrat in that seat. Laura Gillen ran for this seat, and Jay Jacobs fought her. He came out and literally sent an email saying, don't fundraise for Laura. And then he started to back his party lawyer to run for that seat. So this is the problem. When you have good Democrats who step up to run, you have no support. Not only do you not have support from the Democratic Party, you have the Democratic Party fight you. We need a new party chair. We need new county chairs. We need to take over county committee. New Kings Democrats, their Rep Your Block program is phenomenal. We need real organization to do that across the state. Otherwise, nothing is going to change. New York lost us the House. That's the reality. And Jay has no shame. He is not embarrassed that he lost the House. He is out there saying the Democratic Party did a great job. They didn't. And we need to be real about that because we have let this go for too long. No one on Long Island will ever win a real race. We have lost so many seats. If you look at the last few cycles, we just keep losing seats. And the people who are Democrats are there because they owe something to the county chairs and they do what they tell them to do. And that's the reality. And I'm happy to answer so many questions, but I just want to put it out there that we need new county chairs and we need a new state chair.
Wow. Thank you for that testimony, I suppose. What's the one question for you before I move to Alessandra? Have you spoken with this degree of frankness in a public way before?
Probably not this frank.
I mean, it is a sort of,
Yeah.
it is a very newsworthy set of statements that you've made there.
I have talked about some of these things in the past. The reality is that they come after you in a very serious way. I had people who were afraid to support me in the primary because they were afraid for their own safety. They were afraid for their own, if they ran a company and business on Long Island, they were afraid for what would happen to it. That finally gave me a check the night I won the primary and say, now we can support you publicly. We couldn't do it before, we were afraid. So there is a reason that people don't come forward. There's a lot that can happen to somebody who comes forward, but I've had absolutely enough of it. And this is probably the most frank I've ever been publicly.
Anyway, it's sensational what you've said and alarming. And the comments are reflect our gratitude to you for that. I'm certain you're going to be inundated with further inquiries, etc., from our group. But let's just go to Alessandra, who I suspect will not be arguing on the side of Jay Jacobs against you. I suspect this is going to be slightly. Alessandra, can you make your contribution?
I would be more than happy to. And let me just say that so far this evening, I think not only have I learned a tremendous amount, but I really feel exactly what Luba was saying earlier about feeling stressed about not having a strong Democratic Party. It's one of the reasons why, as soon as we lost as badly as we did in the state of New York in these most recent elections, I called for Jay Jacobs to resign. But that was not the first time. So I have 3 slides I want to share because I want to demonstrate something that really does set the case up for why we need to have a new state chair, and then also really explain to everybody, like, what do we do with this anger now, and like, where do we go with it? Because at the end of the day, it's really important to understand why we are fighting for something, which is why we are having this conversation, and also understand the structure upon which we do that. But we also need action and actionable steps in order to do that. So I want to be able to do that with you all right now. So let me just share my screen very quickly. To recap, New York was obviously the state with the worst outcomes. And one of the things I wanted to highlight very acutely here is just, if you look at the last tab here where it says close governor's race by 6 points, it also mentions Senator Schumer's race. Senator Schumer is somebody who has won a tremendous amount of races before, and this margin of 13 points.
So I think we're having problems seeing the slides you're referring to.
Okay, well then let me do it this way perhaps, because maybe you can't see it because it's on a different screen. But I'm just going to really share with you some of the points that I think are really why we're here and how we got here and then what to do. Okay, so I was mentioning about Senator Schumer, the 13-point margin. It might seem like a lot to some of you who are on this call, but that is the smallest margin that he's ever won by. The Attorney General only won by 8 points. We know the governor only won by 6 points. So I want to lay out really how we got here, and I want to reiterate something that was already said, but I want to say it again because it really is one of the most important premises upon which we are going to build from here. The chair of our state Democratic Party, Jay Jacobs, is someone who has repeatedly given our state power, or excuse me, given our state party the power to Republicans. So to empowering Republicans, used that Democratic committee to empower Republicans. You heard Luba talk about it, and you also heard Ben talk about it. This is something that has been going on for a long time. In addition to that, Jay Jacobs is somebody who has been and was hand-selected by Andrew Cuomo. So in many ways, he is really the final and last vestige of that error. He, as we all know, empowered the IDC. In 2020, Jay Jacobs was in support of canceling the Democratic primary elections for safety concerns, while also arguing that his summer camps that he runs should stay open. As you probably also know, he was in charge of, or excuse me, not in charge of, he was supportive of Cuomo's redistricting commission, which was set up in 2013. It's something we all lived through this past year, which was a complete disaster. In 2021, when it came to the ballot initiatives, I cannot emphasize enough how the Democratic Party spent $0, whereas the conservative Republican Party spent $3 million to raise awareness about the ballot initiatives. Things like early voting, amending the redistricting process, actually the ability to change that process, automatic voter registration, $0 to $3 million. In 2021, in that same year, of course, we learned and understood about all of those Long Island losses, which I'll get to in just one second. And then, as we've seen last year and this year, Jay Jacobs has been somebody who has consistently really done a lot of the bidding for the governor on issues that, frankly, are not actually good for the Democratic Party, supporting, of course, as we saw this past week, Hector LaSalle, last year, Madeline Singas, the Court of Appeals judges. And so when we think about all of those things, and that's just a small handful, I think it allows us to zoom out to ask the question, what do we actually need in a new chair? We heard some of those things, but I want to reiterate that again. We need a strong New York State Democratic Party. And that's something that, whether you're progressive or moderate or a socialist or conservative, that's something that we all should be really aimed and geared towards. That's number one. We also need somebody who is going to unify us. We know that there is a lot of depth and a lot of breadth to the perspectives in the party, and an effective strategy is actually a leader who's going to be able to focus on unity and not divisiveness. And when I say that, what I mean is not spend Democratic dollars on Democratic incumbents that are actually doing a great job. So for example, this past summer, Jay Jacobs spent $15,000 to defeat Jabari Brisport and another $15,000 to defeat Gustavo Rivera, two state senators who are doing a tremendous job in the state of New York, as an example. Okay, so replacing the state chair can happen in several ways. The first one is that the governor can remove Jay Jacobs. The second is that the state committee can have a vote of no confidence, and Ben went into that a little bit earlier. And the third is that he can resign, which is something that I don't think that we really can actually count on. And so replacement is the first focus, and replacing him before the 2024 presidential cycle is the goal, primarily because if we do not take the time now to strengthen the New York State Democratic Party, we will have harm not just in the presidential race, but also we have another United States Senate race coming up with Senator Gillibrand's race. And so what does this mean? It means that the person who replaces Jay needs to be somebody who has a strategy and a vision. We heard about the vision from David and others, but when it comes to strategy, one of the things I really want us all just to think about, since we're not used to it, because we're not used to essentially having a state party chair at all, is someone who holds regular meetings. What does that mean? Monthly meeting with the county chairs of each state, of each county. There are 62 counties in the state of New York. Not every one, of course, is democratically run, but there are Democratic county chairs. And so that also means that there should be a county by county mission. And that means that there should be goals every single year that we can measure by quantifiable, measurable results. It also means not spending money simply to defeat the people who are seen as progressive or radical left or eating our own. This is something that this particular state party chair has done, honestly, over and over again. And at the end of the day, it really does actually harm the totality of the party. It also means a commitment to really using the committee for all Democratic candidates. As Ben was mentioning earlier, this is essentially a committee that has one purpose in the rules, but really this is something that we can do through our organizing, professionalizing the position, making it a full-time role, hiring a leadership team that actually has actions in place. For example, a full-time organizing role, voter registration, focusing on Gen Z and the youth, because at the end of the day, this to me is not just important, it's what the numbers show. Gen Z and millennials combined will be the largest voting bloc in American history. And if we don't capitalize on that, we will absolutely see that they will not continue to participate in the democratic process. The last thing I'm going to say before I go to the last piece of this, and I'll put all of these different links into the chat so you all have them. But there has to be a very strong commitment to powerful messaging. And what do I mean by that? Since 2019, when the state Senate passed criminal justice reform, there has been a consistent and an unfortunate undermining of the reforms that have been made. Regardless of where you stand on it, at the end of the day, what has happened is a consistent lack of commitment to addressing some of the fears, some of the falsities, some of the lies that we've seen, and instead really playing into the narrative and playing into the hand of the Republicans. And that unfortunately has led to a lot of people believing that a lot of the statistics that come out of the New York Post and other places are true. And some of them may be true, but not all of them are. And when we lack a strategy to have a conversation with voters and take that proactive messaging, we obviously cede that entire campaign or that entire election to the people who are doing the best at making people afraid. And so those are some of the things that I think relate to replacement. The last thing I'll say about this is that there is a long-term goal also to have Democratic Party reform. And what you can do right now is several things. The first thing you can do is you can join the New York Dems search and party reform committees. I'll put the link in the chat for you. Each committee is going to be bringing recommendations to the General Coalition Zoom meeting that will be taking place on January 25th. It's the second of those meetings, so you haven't missed much. And even if you can't make it on the 25th, there'll be a third meeting. And we want as many people to be there as possible because these two committees, the committee to replace Jay and the committee for party reform, are going to literally get into the weeds of action to have those actionable results to be able to actually work towards having a new chair. The second thing you can do is you can sign up for the Slack channel that this committee has put together. The third thing that you can do is you can go to the replacejjacobs.com website where you can sign up for updates. You could also follow the @replacejjacobs account on Twitter and Instagram. Again, I'm going to put all of this into the chat, but I think the best way for me to end right now, because I know we're over time, is just to really reiterate something that Luba said, which is really important for us to be able to move on and move forward. Most of the people who are elected currently have never even had a conversation with Jay Jacobs. I previously was elected, never had a meeting with him. A lot of people have been in office for a very long time, have never had a meeting with him or even met him. Some people couldn't even identify him if they had to. That's a problem because obviously in order to build a strong Democratic Party, we need to have a relationship with the people who are actually in office. The second thing is that if we're going to have somebody in place, I do think it's important not to have someone who is elected, but also to understand that the person is not going to perpetuate and repeat a lot of the old party paradigms, one of which Luba mentioned, which I'm very familiar with, which is threats. When I ran for the state Senate in 2018, not only was I threatened, but I was told that I would have to leave the state of New York, that I would never have a career in politics, that I was crazy for doing what I was doing. And then they had people literally sleeping outside of my house in a van. And so they take all of these fear-mongering tactics and they use them against their own, essentially eating their own, as opposed to using that energy and momentum towards defeating Republicans, which obviously is why we're all here. So at the end of the day, I know that this is possible. I believe it is, and I'm very grateful for this conversation because this is the way to getting to that result. And for anybody who feels like this is a very large to do, I understand that, but every single large thing that the people on this call and the organizers here have set out to do, they've achieved. So I know that it's possible.
Thank you. Just one clarification. So the primary action that you feel that can be taken immediately is the one you've set out in relation to the search and research party.
That
So-
is assuming that you don't yourself want to become a state committee member, which I would encourage you, of course, to do as well. I'm always in the camp of, if you are interested in actually running for office, specifically for this particular role, becoming a state committee member, your campaign and your election on the state committee could make a significant difference in having a different state party chair.
Great, thank you. Now, I'm slightly trying to work out how to incorporate into the next phase of the discussion the questions from the over 250 participants who are with us. So what I would suggest is that you type I mean, there's lots of comments that have been in the meeting chat. Could you type, if you were to type a comment, a question in there for somebody, I would be delighted to convey that. I will just say a couple of things though, from my own perspective on all of this, which is that what we have to, we've heard a lot of kind of slightly daunting and intimidating stories, which put us in touch with the reality of what the New York State Democratic Party is. But we should also, I sort of take this from sports psychology. I've just put yourself in the other locker room for a second. They are terrified of us. We just knocked over Hector LaSalle, unprecedented. Alessandra Biaggi wouldn't be here except for a few thousand people who won that special election, and I remember that special election very well. And before then, Cuomo himself was knocked over, and Hochul is under enormous pressure now. And we have enormous power as a New York grassroots. And the concept that I feel is sort of insufficiently recognized by the political science establishment and of course by the political establishment is precisely the kind of meeting we are having here, which would not have occurred before 2016. And the term I use for it is the Axe Blue Army. Billions and billions of dollars and billions of man and in particular woman hours are going into this movement. And every time it astonishes me that the Democratic Party has an adversarial relationship with us, when all we want to do is to write checks to them and vote for them and win and volunteer for them. That's all we want to do. So I think we have enormous power.
We're at 90 minutes, so we probably only have time for a couple of things. And Nye, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hello, everyone. Nye Whitaker. I see many of my great allies on this call. Thank you for this presentation. And it's just a comment that I think needs to be part of the conversation. Really quick, Joseph, I am a former women's vote director for the New York State Party, former senior advisor for New York State for the DNC for Biden-Harris. I worked with Alessandra in the governor's office, former county committee woman, former executive committee member of the Manhattan Democratic Party. But in 2012, I built a coalition of 70,000 volunteers across the state of New York to help usher in many wins. Also in 2018, as executive director of Emerge, recruiting and training women to run for office. There is one conversation I just want to add. As a woman of color, we've had conversations like this many times. So this isn't the first Mr. O'Neill conversation like this. But I think that coming from my district, and I've run for office 3 times, in doing so, and I've worked on many major campaigns. I actually now work in DC at the White House. There's a conversation that's not being had that I think this particular group and all of my fellow organizers and coalition builders need to think about. Even if you change the top, what is the structure of the staff to support the effort? So I think as you have this conversation, I wanted to add to it the thought, we need a political director. We need a director of communications. We need a director of voter engagement. We need a director of voter protection. We need to now look to states like North Carolina and others, look at their structure and make sure that we have the funding and the support for those staff members to go do the valuable work. I live in East Harlem. We had a minus 24% turnout. If communities of color, and I'm even just looking at this call, and please forgive me, I'm one of the few people of color on this call, are not at the table, are not part of the conversation, are not being put in positions of power to move our city and our country forward, we will be having the same conversation again. Because in 2020, with our 70,000 volunteers of New York for Biden-Harris that I co-founded, and many of you here volunteered on, we took it to the party and said, we'd love to gift you this. We would gift you this army. We would work with you. We got all these people mobilized in the pandemic, and we should work together to continue this coalition building into the next cycle, 2022, 2024, and yet we're having the same conversation again. So I just wanted to add to that conversation. I put my email in the chat. I am happy, many of you know me, to continue the work. We are restarting again, and I don't think that we should be restarting every cycle. We should be continuing the momentum. So just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you for adding that. All great points. And yeah, we don't want to keep starting over every session.
Just wanted to mention somebody had asked in the chat if somebody could help them get started in understanding how to run for state committee. And I would love to help anybody who's even remotely interested or curious about how to run for state committee or what the position entails. I will walk you through the whole thing. Feel free to reach out to me. I will drop my email in the chat again, but it's ben@benjaminyee.com. And then I guess the last thing I'll just say is if you're one of the odd people who really likes hearing about the state committee and like the minutia, you should find your state committee member for sure. If you have a state committee member who is accessible, not all of them are, and willing to talk to you, but I do write a newsletter about honestly this kind of stuff, which most people, think is boring. But if you're the kind of person who doesn't think it's boring, you can sign up at benjaminyee.com and you'll get like 6-page emails about what happened in the state committee the other day. I'm just throwing that out there.
Joseph, it's Dave Pepper. Could I add one other point just from a national perspective? So I put this in my book. We are seeing, this attack on democracy through state houses like Ohio's, like horrible stuff. I mean, the book is literally called Laboratories of Autocracy. And beyond the disappointment of not winning congressional seats in New York, we clearly should be winning. The other thing that happens in what I've heard tonight, whenever I try to push for a certain voting reform, the Secretary of State in Ohio would point to New York State and tell us, well, New York doesn't do that. It'd be used against us. And we have other states like Washington State and Oregon, cutting edge drop boxes, early vote. So one of the things that I put this in my book, and not to stick it all on the blue states, but it is incumbent in a battle for democracy much bigger than any one state, that those states that have the power to become laboratories of democracy and create models and best practices that lift voters and give voters voice and reflect our diverse democracy, my God, it has to happen. Because one, it ends up being a best practice like Oregon and Washington State, that we in states like Ohio can say, look what they're doing in those states. That's what we should be doing. In worst case, so we don't have states like New York used against us, which literally happened when I was chair. They could point every time I'd say, by clawing back early vote, you're suppressing the vote. They'd always point to New York or somewhere else. So it's not only harmful in terms of individual offices being sought, the broader narrative about democracy is really hurt when Democrats aren't living up to these broader pro-democracy values. And I think some of what we're hearing tonight is part of that problem.
Great. Well, again, we have a link tree that Sarah has been putting in the chat. I just want to remind people that there are links there to sign up for the meetings and committees that Alessandra brought up. And also there's a list, you can follow everybody that's here on there, and also the organization, so that we can all stay together in touch and we can be fighting this together. And we really appreciate this great turnout tonight. It's real, it's great to know that other people want to make a change in New York. And we really appreciate all our panelists. And thank you, Joseph, so much for moderating for us. This has been amazing. And we hope that people will sign up and keep in touch. We also have our organization's newsletter links in there, so you can hear more about more events like this and more organizing and more activism. So thank you so much for being here tonight and for educating us and working with us.
Lisa, before we actually sign off, I thought we were going to try to get like one takeaway action item from each panelist. I know Alessandra's already given us some, and So it's Ben, but like if we should just go around the speakers and yeah, do that before we sign off, if that's okay.
I get to start. Well, top of the list, get involved in county committee and state committee. We've talked a lot about state committee, but county committee in so many places still, particularly in New York City, has massive vacancies. And there's really good reasons why those vacancies exist. And it's because the party establishment doesn't want you involved. And they have reasons for that as well. Again, we could go on a long time about exactly why this is the case, but look up organizations like New Kings Democrats, local Democratic clubs in Manhattan. Come to me, I'm happy to hook you up with whoever's running county committee candidates where you live, or state committee candidates. But it's just so important. It's like having another vote. It's an organization that has a tremendous impact on the outcomes of our elections, on the health of our democracy. And you might vote in the primary, you might vote in the general election. Take your vote and cast it inside the Democratic Party as well as one of these elected representatives.
I think the most important thing, in addition to, of course, getting involved in the organizing effort, is just become aware of who your county committee members are and familiarize yourself with them, because you might not be somebody that wants to run, which is fine, but you should know who they are, and you should actually reach out to them and ask what their opinion is on Jay Jacobs and push them, because at the end of the day, if they're not willing to share or are going to avoid that kind of a question in this moment, they are demonstrating that they're not essentially leading, and that doesn't really work. So that's my addendum to all of the other things I said. Thank you all so much for having this.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, as the guy from Too Far Away to Becoming Too Much, what I would say is maybe each person write your own mission statement of what the state party should do. What would it look like? And so much flows from that. So whether or not it's being met will become very clear. And I think once you lay that up top, everything else follows, frankly, down to the counties and everything else, and the alignment and relationships with other groups that are out there. So think about what if you were to write a 3 or 4 sentence. Again, mine was something like, and I did it from the very beginning, help basically connect people into public service. And once they get them, help to do great public service in their community. It defined everything else. And I'd challenge people to think about what they would write as the mission statement of a strong, well-run party.
So, I mean, Ben said county committee. I really do want to emphasize the way you get onto county committee is that you petition yourself on. You basically knock on your neighbors' doors. You go door to door, you tell them about Democratic County Committee, which none of them have ever heard before, because no one's ever come to their door with an individual county committee petition before in almost all cases. And you come to them and you talk to them about this. It's a great opportunity to meet your neighbors. It's a great opportunity to start sort of becoming like a block captain. If you can do it within an organization, here in Brooklyn, we've got the Rep Your Block organization, a number of other clubs and counties and towns do this. It's a really great way to like get in on the lowest ground floor of politics. And it's also a place where like, if you're worried about like, oh, who's going, you're not crowding anybody out. There are just huge vacancies everywhere. So it's a great place to get started. The other thing that I would say along with this is that competitive state committee races are going to be coming up in probably some in 2023. I don't know exactly where, certainly quite a few in 2024. These are places, if you are a kind of person who donates to campaigns, you cannot imagine how far your $50 or $100 goes to a state committee race. The most money you'll see raised by a state committee candidate is, in a few cases, people will get to 10 or 12 or 15,000. Lots of winning state committee candidates get there with a few $1,000s. If you are donating that kind of just small donor money, you can make a huge difference. So find those local state committee members, candidates who want to make a change, and your donation money will go very, very far. I will push the Brooklyn Can't Wait campaign, and I'd be happy to anyone who wants to run for state committee outside of Brooklyn. We put together a lot of resources that I think are transferable, but the Brooklyn Can't Wait campaign is really focused on changing the state committee in Brooklyn. That also changes the leadership of the county party in Brooklyn. So that's been one of our focuses, but definitely getting involved in those county and state committee races, running yourself, donating money, is just this like huge force multiplier because you are local and because there's so little money involved in them.
And everyone else has said county committee. And the reality is that, and I don't think anybody mentioned this earlier, but so many of our seats are actually determined by county committee, because in special elections, it's county committee who actually selects the candidate. So many people who are in office were not elected by the majority of people in their district. They were elected by county committee members. So join county committee, but I can't tell you to do that on your own. I'm going to tell you to go to New Kings Democrat and look at their Rep Your Block program. But I'm also going to tell you, you have to get a huge group of friends to do it with you, because when you get in there, if you're one person to do it, you're not going to have any sort of ability to make a difference, but you will also drive yourself insane. Listening to Garrett, I'm glad to hear that ISLIP is changing. And I think that's wonderful. The reality is, and this is something that David mentioned earlier about having state party chairs that don't have the longevity to actually build anything, we have the opposite problems. We have state chairs and county chairs that stay in for their entire career and they make multiple salaries. We have people who make a salary as the town chairman, the town supervisor, and the county committee, the county supervisor, I can't even think of the word, the county chair, and the town supervisor, and also make money being a lawyer for the county. So it's all this double and triple dipping, and they are there forever. And you can have one town council, one town committee actually get some really good county committee people on it. But if you're not going to get enough people on it so they can actually vote out the current leadership and vote in new leadership, there will be no permanent change. So join county committee with a huge group of friends and make sure that you actually have the support and you're organized so we can elect new leadership.
Thank you, Luba, and definitely all politics are local. So hopefully a lot of us will see each other at county committee meetings. And Joseph, why don't you close us out?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would suggest is from my own kind of line of work really is to try. It's very important to develop a public discourse about this. If it's a kind of water cooler conversation like the IDC, no one had heard about it, but then everyone had heard about it, and it makes a huge difference. And you will get a lot more. You'll have a lot more success with the grassroots county committee efforts if they are at the top of the pyramid of discussion and consensus. And I think we're actually quite close to building a consensus that the New York State Democratic Party needs to change. I think there is a vision of New York as a potential blue juggernaut, which is within reach from the point of view of narrative, political narrative. So I suppose what people could do is, I mean, it sounds, it's so denigrated, Twitter and social media, but it's actually grassroots activism really, really is helped by social media. So whatever you can do to identify and amplify the voices critical of Jay Jacobs and the establishment, I think that is actually quite helpful, and certainly causes them sleepless nights. So that's my contribution.
All right. Well, with that, see
Hold
everyone.
on, Luba wants to say something.
Sorry, Luba,
And
what
then
were
can I just want to point out, I just dropped a City and State article that everyone should read in the chat. It's like why we're still losing, why the Democrats keep losing. It's a brilliant article because it talks about Rich Schaefer and the corruption, but the reality is and it's ridiculous, but there is a photo of him leaning at his desk looking all corrupt and Boss Tweed like, and he takes a lot of pleasure in that, and he doesn't shy away from that role, and neither does Jay Jacobs. So for anybody who wants to understand how Long Island politics and New York State politics work, it's a really great article to read. And no one is trying to hide the corruption. It's so embedded that there are so many people who need to get involved to actually fix it. So read that article. That's also a good start.
Okay.
I'm gonna put it in again. Sarah just asked me. I'm dropping it right now.
Yeah,
Great.
well, you can add it actually to our link for.
We'll
link tree
add
for
it to
today
our
so
link
everyone
tree,
can
and
find it.
we'll hopefully see all of you or many of you at future meetings of the coalition and future Zooms and on Twitter and at our county committee meetings. And I just want to say thanks again for joining us, and good night.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank
Good night.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.